So let me just introduce myself briefly. I am a technology attorney, even though that was probably a relatively poor evidence of my skill set. But for approximately, I'd say 20 plus years, I have been involved almost exclusively in the ERP space, both as an in-house attorney and representing both small to mid-sized software companies, and also representing licensees or customers of software vendors, as well as integrators of software systems. So I think what I can bring to the table, and I really do hope this is interactive and that you're asking a lot of questions, because I can give you the perspective of both from the inside and also from what I think is reasonable. And in every negotiation that you get into and every litigation, there's what both sides want and where they're going to meet in the middle. So some of the objectives for this session today are going to be to really provide you with an understanding of the common reasons why ERP implementations will typically fail. And I think you can generally say that, and you're right, that every ERP implementation is different. Okay, it's going to be different in scope, it's going to be different in size, it will definitely be different in industry, and certainly the type of functionality or solution that's being implemented is going to vary widely. But they almost all fail for similar reasons. So while they're all different, the challenges and the issues that you're going to encounter are almost always going to be, if not identical, then certainly very similar. I think it's incumbent upon me today to share with you so that you have an understanding of how to minimize the likelihood that your ERP implementation or integration is going to fail. And I think there are certain steps that are tried and true that if you take on the front end, that are really going to pay off in spades on the back end. And then, God forbid, to the extent that you are in a situation that you can't get out of and litigation seems like it is an option for you, I want you to walk away from this understanding what you're up against, what the likely costs are going to be, what some of the likely outcomes would be, what the likely arguments that you're going to make, and what the vendor is going to make, so that you're well prepared, for really kind of the 10,000 foot level of getting involved in the ERP implementation. You are going to have an understanding of what to look out for, how to minimize the likelihood that these issues are going to arise, and if they do, you're going to be at least somewhat knowledgeable of what that litigation landscape is going to look like. So I think, without a doubt, every ERP implementation that you get involved in is going to take longer than you expected. The front end estimations as to how long the implementation are going to take are really best case scenarios that are told to you by, in my view, overly aggressive salespeople that are concerned only with you signing the contract and them getting a commission. So they're going to downplay how difficult it might be, how long it's going to take. Certainly, I think it's going to cost more than you anticipate, and it's going to cost in some ways or sometimes significantly more than what has been estimated to you. I think if you get an estimate from a vendor as to how long and how much it's going to cost, I think from a cost perspective, you need to think at least 30% more, at least. And then I think you have to have certainly reasonable expectations, and you've got to tamp them down sometimes significantly. Surveys that I have read, surveys that I know Third Stage has conducted, indicate that really, the majority of businesses out there simply don't realize the majority of the business benefits that they expected to receive from the software implementation or the software once it was implemented. So, for a system that sometimes is costing many hundreds of thousands to many millions of dollars for, you not to receive the majority of the business benefits that you thought that you were going to get is certainly, problematic. And I think there's ways to minimize the likelihood of that happening to you. Okay, so how do these challenges play out in real life? Okay, I want to go through a couple of examples. I think by necessity we've got to kind of treat these from a 10,000 foot level for a variety of reasons. One, LK Plastics is a real case that I am litigating now. I can't, in good conscience, share anything that would be privileged or confidential, but I can give you insights as they are disclosed in documents that would be publicly available on the court's websites, or documents that you could go to the courthouse and pull. BBSI is another failed Oracle implementation that I can give you some insight into. I am not involved in that one, but I've got a general understanding from some of the attorneys that are involved in that case of how it's going and what to look out for and what you could expect if you're going to litigate against Oracle/NetSuite. Janco, I want to talk about that briefly. That really is kind of an oddity, and that's a situation that has arisen for Janco out of a failed implementation, but really out of the way that they financed that deal, and it's also happened to LK Plastics. So we'll talk about that in a second. So let's go into LK. LK is a company that you may or may not have heard about. It is a global supplier of packaging, primarily for the food service and healthcare industries, though they do provide what they would call flexible packaging for industry in general. So these are the kinds of packaging that your Lunchables will come in, or some kind of interesting yogurt packaging. This is the kind of product that they make. They've got multiple distribution centers throughout the country, and we're in the process when they reached out to Oracle of wanting to replace their 15-year-old legacy system. It was a system from Texas, TECSYS, which is, I'd say, a third-tier software provider based in Canada that we've dealt with extensively in the past, both from a litigation standpoint and from a contract negotiation standpoint. So LK in 2017 issues an RFP detailing specifically what their requirements for the new system were. And essentially, I think you can boil it down and say that in a nutshell, it's safe to say that, LK was looking to, upgrade their technology system, their computer systems, with a system that would be better than the system that they had previously installed, right? I mean, you don't go into this wanting to take a technological step backward, or, as LK would allege, multiple steps back. So when Oracle started implementing the NetSuite system, it became readily apparent that the processing times within the system for all transactions were generally between 4 seconds on the top end to 30 seconds, as maybe an outlier, but certainly performance times within the system to do any transaction, whether it was taking orders or whatnot, was between 4 and 30 seconds, with an average, say, of 15 seconds per transaction, which for I think any modern commercial enterprise, that's simply just unworkable for at least modern commercial needs. And just to give you an idea of how bad that was, by way of comparison, LK's legacy system was able to process transactions in the system in approximately 2 seconds. So they were going from 2 seconds to 4, and in some cases to 30. Now, LK wasn't silent about this. To get the processing speeds down, Oracle said, essentially, give me more money, give me more patience, and give me more time, and we can get this to work for you in the way that it was represented during the sales cycle. And I preface this with these are all allegations, right? But essentially, what LK would allege is that Oracle urged them to implement additional functionality and to customize the system extensively by way of 20 individual customizations to get the software to work, as LK would say, as represented during the sales process, to the tune of about, I'd say $3 million. LK listens to Oracle, implements these customizations and modifications, it doesn't have any kind of substantial impact on the speed of the system. And LK asserts that the software is essentially unusable. That's the biggest issue with LK. There's certain other issues with the way that pallets were organized, the way that shipping labels were processed. So, all of that kind of falls under one bucket of ending up with a system that is really just unworkable for modern commercial needs. Barrett Business Services, Inc., BBSI, is a well-known provider of business management solutions for primarily small to mid-sized companies. BBSI enters into an Oracle license agreement, and once it does, for whatever reason, Oracle's salespeople begin aggressively pushing Oracle's HCM cloud functionality. And the allegations in this case are that Oracle severely, substantially misrepresented the capabilities of that HCM functionality, and then at the same time downplayed its limitations. BBSI alleges in its court filings that only after it signed a $15 million licensing deal and then a $500,000 statement of work did it discover that the HCM system was essentially riddled with design, functionality, interface, and integration gaps. So massive gaps in functionality. And it wasn't, as they say, Oracle represented an out-of-the-box piece of software with out-of-the-box functionality that could be used. And to get over the functionality gaps, Oracle had proposed a 2-year process at a cost of $33 million for customizations, which the original estimation for customizations to the system was about $6 million. So, again, not a situation that you want to end up in. Janco, again, it's an Oracle deal. And just as an aside, I'm highlighting Oracle and NetSuite deals because we've been personally involved with them recently. And I think, the NetSuite solution is perceived to be, in my view, as something that's easier to implement, that isn't as complex as, say, an SAP system. And I think certainly Oracle pitches it that way, but I think you've got to be aware. I don't think that, Oracle in and of itself is more likely to have issues or failures than any other system. I think it's just, it's easier to kind of to highlight and pick on. One reason for that is that they've got way more customers, and if you've got a high number of customers, the likelihood that any one of them is going to sue you becomes higher. So these are just easier for us to find to some extent. Janco, it's a similar situation. They implement the software. They say that it has substantial gaps in functionality, and it's just unusable and doesn't work for them. The twist with the Janco situation, and it's not unlike the LK situation, is that Oracle pitches these things as kind of a low-cost alternative to more complicated systems. And one of the ways they do that is they say, look, you can finance your purchase. And of course, what you do is you enter into an agreement with Oracle's financing company. Sometimes those contracts are then sold out to another financing company, but regardless of how it plays out, you are ultimately on the hook, and they decouple the performance of the software from the obligation to pay. So it doesn't matter that you have nothing to show for the investment that you've made. The financing company is going to sue you. And so, if you're contemplating financing the deal, I would suggest that you do not do that. Because I think you're just inviting trouble, and you really take away a lot of the leverage that you've got, and you give Oracle and its financing arm a sledgehammer to beat you over the head with if there ever is litigation. So, what are the takeaways from these case studies, these pieces of litigation? And I think one is, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second, there is enough blame to go around. In any one of these cases, there always is enough blame to go around. I don't think that you can squarely point the finger in all situations at the software vendor or the integrator, and I don't think you can squarely point the finger at the customer either. But I think the common themes that we see, certainly on the vendor side, and these are the allegations that I will guarantee Oracle is making in these other cases and is making in the case that I've got, they will say that the customer expected the new software system to operate in the same exact way as the 15-year-old legacy system. They were unwilling to change. The customizations were primarily for the purposes of getting the software to work just the same way as the old system. Now, I think there's some legitimacy to that, just generally, not necessarily in this cases, but in certain cases. But the lesson is you've got to be willing to change, right? You can't customize the system with $33 million in customizations and expect it to work flawlessly and expect it to be easy to maintain. And that says nothing to that you've just blown your budget, you're outside of scope. There's no way that any kind of estimations as to cost or timelines are going to be met when you're doing that amount of customizations. And as we say here, software customizations will absolutely kill a project. In the LK case, they essentially did everything right. They had hired, and this is in the documents, they had hired a third-party software selection company to identify what their business processes were, to identify a software vendor that would provide a system that had the least amount of gaps, and they still had issues, right? So, choosing the right integrator and the right vendor is certainly incredibly important, but I think, it's not the only answer. I think the answer is, managing the project, having reasonable expectations, and going in with your eyes wide open so that what failure looks like and how to minimize the likelihood that it can happen. I think one of the keys that we see consistently in these cases and other cases is that executive misalignment can absolutely kill a project. I mean, if your executives don't understand the business processes or understand them with the specificity that you think they need to, or there's competing interest as to what system is going to be the right system, and then somebody wants SAP, somebody wants Oracle, and the people that are in charge don't get their way. I think the likelihood that them being misaligned with a project is going to have an adverse impact is relatively high. And the last thing is, what you see in each one of these cases is the customer alleging that the software doesn't work. Okay. And I think, they've got a legitimate basis for that, but you also have to understand, I mean, is it the software that's not working, or is it really just failing to work for your business, right? And, the vendor is going to argue, well, we've implemented this software successfully in hundreds of thousands of companies around the world, and there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that you've done it that leads you to argue that it can't work for you. So, I think, point of fact, these things don't fail because of a technology issue necessarily, right? It's not a failure of technology. It's a failure of people. It's a failure to manage the process correctly. And that's what we see over and over. So that's kind of the broad scope. So let's get into, what are the substantive lessons that you can take away from these examples of failure? And let's go to the next slide. So, the first thing is, and we'll get into these in more detail, you've really got to define clear project goals. If you don't know why you're implementing an ERP system, you really have a problem. If you're implementing it simply because everyone else in your industry is implementing that project or that software product rather, then I think you're setting yourself up for failure. I think you've got to understand what types of functionality you need, how they're going to address your business requirements. You've got to understand, how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take. If you don't have an understanding of those things, you're really doing yourself a disservice. You have to have an intimate understanding of what your business requirements are, because only if you have an understanding of what the requirements are and you've gone through the painful process of understanding them, of workflowing them, of getting your handle on what the business requirements are, that's the only way you're going to understand if there's a gap in functionality or not. And then once you understand whether there is a gap or not, you're going to be able to make a reasoned decision as to whether you can live with that gap. It's something that's got to be addressed programmatically through customizations, or there's some other methodology which you can deal with. Choosing the right software, I said, it's not as important sometimes, but it certainly, if you don't choose the right software, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? I think, if you've got, say you haven't chosen the software that's 100% for you, I don't think that automatically means that you're going to fail, but I think it certainly makes it more difficult. And you've got to have realistic expectations. I mean, is 4 seconds unreasonable for modern commercial needs? I don't know. It depends on what that transaction is and how important it is. 30 seconds, I think, certainly is, unreasonable. But you've got to have realistic expectations for what the software can do. The business advantages it is going to provide to you. You've got to have realistic expectations with respect to how long the implementation is going to take. You have to have reasonable expectations about how much it's going to cost. And we talked about developing process workflows. That's something that you've got to go through the pain of doing. I've had a client in the past that didn't want to do that and left it up to the software company. And as you can imagine, that didn't work out very well. And then, finally, you have to be, super diligent and almost have a micromanagement kind of style to some extent, with some exceptions, in the management of the scope and the management of the costs of the project, because, you've got diverse, the interest of the vendor, whether it's the integrator or the software vendor who's doing the integration, their interest is divergent from your interest, right? They are happy to have you on the roll for as long as it's going to take. They generate revenue from more customizations, more modifications, more billable hours, and they're not particularly interested in taking a reasoned and measured approach to this. And if you're not stepping in to tightly rein them in, then they're going to go off the rails, so to speak. So next slide. Okay, so we talked about project goals, and I think you've got to make an effort to establish what the goals are as early as possible on the front end. And I think if you don't understand, like I said, why you're implementing your ERP system, then you're setting yourself up for failure. Again, if it's simply because you want the latest and greatest, that's not a reason to implement something, right? If it's because everybody else in your industry is doing it, again, you're setting yourself up for failure. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to have identified and quantify opportunities for improvement with respect to your business flow, your business processes, and then identify the software system that matches most closely to where you want to get and how you do business, not only today, but how you want to do business in the future. Because only by understanding what your goal is, and again, it's not a technology goal. It can't be a technology goal necessarily. It's got to be a business goal. These are business processes. These are business systems. And the goal of the system, just generally speaking, is to run your business more efficiently, right? And if you don't have an understanding of how the system is going to do that, then I think the likelihood that you're going to end up in litigation is increased. Let's go to the next slide. And this goes hand in hand. You've got, like I said, to put the work in to understand what the business requirements are. You can't do that, by the seat of your pants. You can't do that with any really, degree of success while the implementation is happening. I think you've got to do it on the front end. You've got to have an understanding of what your requirements are prior to engaging in the evaluation and selection process. I mean, if you're going into a software demo and you're asked to rate how good a system is, and you don't understand what the requirement is that you're assessing the software against, how are you making a reasoned decision, right? And I think the key to this, and to some extent I said it already, is really to focus on, how you're doing business today, how you can improve on the business processes that you're utilizing so that you can be where you want to be tomorrow, right? I think one of the key issues that you've got to think about too, from a business requirement standing perspective, is what are your deal breakers, right? Because no software system is going to match 100% with your business requirements. It's just not possible. Every software can be customized. Every software is going to have a gap, and it's not going to be a one-to-one 100% fit. So you've got to understand what your deal breakers are, and you've got to lead with those as you go into these evaluations and when you're selecting the software that you think you want to integrate. From the LK case, their deal breaker apparently was how fast the system is going to run, right? And one of the key questions in the litigation is going to be, well, did you tell anybody, right? And what did you tell them about that? And I think a fair question, and this is not necessarily for the LK case, but with any software implementation, is when there's a key failure, right? When the software doesn't do something that you deem to be key to your business, how do you even get into that situation? And I think it's because you didn't go through the business requirements process, and you certainly didn't prioritize your deal breakers. Because if you had, you would have said, here are the 3 things that we need from this software system. It has to do this, it has to do this, and it has to do this. And if you do that, then I think the likelihood that you're going to end up in a lawsuit on the back end saying, well, the software didn't function in the way that we expected it to, or it didn't perform this key functionality or piece of functionality that was the most important thing for a business. Okay. So how do you get there? How do you prioritize deal breakers? I think you've got to engage your key employees and key decision makers. You've got to go, a couple rungs down to make sure that these individuals that actually, are in the trenches every day, that you're talking to them and that you take into account, how they do business and what they see with respect to the software, their utilization of the software, and what they deem to be important with the software. So next slide. And again, the lesson learned here is choose the right software, right? And again, choosing the right software isn't a panacea. It's not going to necessarily guarantee that your project is successful and that you won't end up in litigation, but I think it's going to go a long way. Even with the right software, the software that has the least amount of gaps, I think you can still go off the rails. Certainly, if you implement the wrong software, you've got a problem, right? If the software clearly doesn't meet the majority of your business requirements, I think you're guaranteeing that you're going to fail. One of the key takeaways, when you're evaluating the software and you're involved in the sales cycle, is that you absolutely need to be critical of what the software vendor is telling you. I think that that's common sense. I think it just makes sense. But people get so caught up in the bells and whistles and the sizzle that they forget to look behind the curtain and see if there's anything substantial there, right? You don't buy the sizzle, you buy the steak. And the steak isn't necessarily sexy, right? It's all the fancy screens and the beautiful way the software looks and the modifications that you can do to it. That's what sells software to some extent, but that's not what's going to make you successful. I think that you've got to understand that, time and time again, we get complaints in my office about overly aggressive software salespeople that minimize the gaps in functionality. They minimize the difficulty associated with the software system, but maximize the perceived value of that system and the business benefits that you're going to realize. And I think you have to take it with a grain of salt, because if you don't, you're going to buy right into what they're selling you, and it just doesn't make any sense. And there's reasons why people do that. There's all sorts of politics associated with these kinds of selections and business environments that are toxic, so to speak. and people are invested in certain systems, and it's what they've used. But you've got to cut through it. You've got to see it for what it is. You've got to ask the right questions. And, part of this process, I think, in my experience, certainly on both sides of these deals, is you've got to do site visits. You've got to go see how other companies in your industry are actually using the software. And I think it's incumbent upon you as well to have the freedom and to demand that you've got the freedom to ask the right questions, to talk to the people that are using the software, because what happens time and time again is that, the vendor's not going to set you up for a visit with somebody that's not happy with the software, right? So you're getting a biased view of how that software works, and it might only be kind of tangentially in your industry, which doesn't provide a lot of value. And one of the other great secrets of the software vendor, play is that they absolutely give these people incentives to say nice things to you, right? They give them free customizations, free modifications, free maintenance, free support, additional years on their subscription, whatever it is. So, you've got to look at this all with a jaundiced eye to be able to evaluate the software in the right way. I think it goes without saying, and in some ways, these lessons kind of fall back on each other to some extent, right? You've got to have realistic expectations, and I think how do you know, right? Part of it is asking the right questions in site visits and demonstrations, not being swayed by the sizzle, looking for the steak, grounding yourself in reality. But to the extent that you can, I think you really want to benchmark your implementation against other similar implementations. That's going to be incredibly valuable to you as a tool to really, have an understanding of what the lay of the land is and what you're getting yourself involved in. And how do you do that? Well, I think you look at market studies, you look at people that are in your industry that are similar sizes, that have implemented a similar system, how long it has taken and how much they spent. Were they under budget? Were they over budget? That's critical to your success, to really have an understanding of what you're getting into. And to be honest with you, there's no shortage of consultancies that do these kinds of analyses and are more than happy to talk to you. So I think you've got to know what's out there. You've got to utilize resources that you've got. I think spending a little bit of money on these kinds of things on the front end is really going to serve you well and minimize the likelihood that you're going to spend a ton more money on the back end. I think to some extent, if you only focus on technical issues, again, you're kind of missing the point. Okay, technical issues are going to be important for understanding what you're getting into, right? And understanding whether the software is a good fit or not. And that, like we said, that's important, but it's not dispositive. I think in addition to focusing on technical issues, you've got to focus on the non-technical issues. You've got to focus on organizational change management. It's incredibly important. Getting over the hump of the resistance to implementing a new system is critical. It's probably one of the most critical things that you can do. I think you've got to invest in user training. You've got to make sure that everybody is on board with the system, how it operates, and that they've got some level of excitement about transitioning to a new system. And then you've got to deal with this concept of user acceptance. And I think that can go in a couple of ways. One, users just generally have to be able to accept the process, right? Accept the fact that they're getting a new software system. But I think this goes back to involving key decision makers. You want to have a user acceptance process, whereby key users are actually making a determination as to whether the software's fit and functionality actually makes sense, and to the extent it doesn't, that there's a way to tweak the software to get it to work in the way that is expected or in the way that was represented. And there's a fine line here too, right? You're not trying to replicate the legacy system necessarily, but the business requirements need to be met. And the only way to do that is with user acceptance and user analysis and user input. Next slide. Well, and here you go, right? Involve key users in the process. I think, again, sticking with the theme of focusing on not just technical issues, but non-technical issues, you've got to view the ERP project as a business initiative and not a technology project. You can't necessarily let your IT department just run with the whole thing. There's got to be a holistic approach to the whole thing, and you've got to make sure that you involve your users for the duration of the implementation project from the very beginning to the very end. Don't make the mistake that I've seen with my clients, where they think, okay, well, the software vendor told me that this software system is designed specifically for my industry. It contains industry best practices that I need to adapt my workflows and my business processes to. Even software that's sold as off the shelf is going to need some modification or some customization. There will be a functionality gap. You've got to understand and define what your business processes are, your business requirements. You've got to spend a substantive amount of time, defining what your workflows are, because if you don't, I don't think you're going to understand, where the functionality gaps are, how your business needs to change to accommodate the software, or how the software can change to accommodate your business processes and your workflows. I had a situation with a client about 3 or 4 years ago, and I might have mentioned it already, where they just washed their hands of this whole process. Okay, they said, we understand how our business works. You will explain it to you, but we're not going to spend substantive time, going through flow charts and diagrams so that you have an understanding as the vendor or the integrator into our business. We'll explain it to you generally, but the software is supposed to have, best practices integrated into it already. So this is an unnecessary process. Not surprisingly, that integration failed. Okay, so you can't short shift this process, and I don't think you can emphasize it enough. Next slide. How do you manage the scope and the cost of the project, right? I think on the front end, what you've got to do is you've got to negotiate contracts that really serve as a management tool for this kind of process. You've got to have change orders. You've got to have flexibility within that contract to be able to approve and to reject vendor consultants. You want to be able to have the ability to look at their resumes. You want to have key person clauses to the extent it makes sense, because I think what happens on the vendor side is they're going to direct their consultants to the projects that are the most profitable, or the project that they're going to make the most money off of, right? So if you're sitting here with a measly $2 million implementation project, and they've got GM with a $50 million implementation project, you can bet that the $50 million project is going to get the lion's share of the consultants, and that you're going to get kind of the B team, the C team, or even the D team. So and this is not uncommon, by the way. I mean, we see this happen on a pretty regular basis, where one of the allegations is that the vendor used the client's implementation project as a training ground for incompetent and inexperienced consultants. So you've got to ensure that the project teams, not only on the vendor side, but on your side, have the requisite experience. And I think you've got to put in the contract language that allows you to verify what the experience level is and to protect yourself. I think these implementation projects live and die by the statement of work. Okay, the statement of work, to me, is probably the most important document that you're going to sign. Sure, the software license or the SaaS agreement is important, but again, the software probably works, right? The consulting agreement or the master services agreement is an important document, but that's a legal document that sets forth, what happens with respect to warranties and representations and limitations of liabilities and remedies. And that's all important if you've got to leverage it. But the document that you're going to go back to, the document that is going to manage that implementation project on a day-to-day basis, is really the statement of work. And in that document, you have to ensure that you include as much detail as possible. You have to have deadlines. You've got to have milestones. You've got to have a user acceptance testing process that says something like, okay, the deliverables are going to be delivered on this day. We're going to have a 2-week process to review to make sure that they are are consistent with mutually agreed upon specifications for that deliverable. And if they don't substantially comply with those specifications, there's got to be a process that details what happens. You send it back, they get another try, they redeliver it to you. What if it doesn't comply with the specs again? Then what happens? Do you get a refund? Do you give them another bite at the apple? Do you terminate the contract? Do you get a discount? Do you not pay for the services that are associated to bring it in line with the specifications? What if they can't? All of that needs to be detailed with a very high level of specificity in the contract. And then I think, to some extent, you want to have a plan for software customizations. You want to make sure that you understand, what customizations that you think you might need. You want to have some sort of an estimate as to the cost associated with those, and really have an understanding of what business process or business requirement they're going to address. So, the goal is use the statement of work and the contract framework generally as a tool to manage the vendor, because the ideal is, you want to be able to put your feet up on your desk. The vendor's going a little bit sideways. You want to pull that contract out from a drawer. You want to be able to point to some certain provisions and say, no, this is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're contractually obligated to do. And this is what you are going to do. Because I think that just serves to protect you. Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, and Marcus, real quick here, it looks like we had a question in the comments that talked about finding a balance between standard and customization. Can you just elaborate from a contractual standpoint, maybe cover some best practices on how to find that right balance?
Yeah, and I think that's a real kind of gray line, right? Because I think the vendor is going to sell the software system as an out-of-the-box, off-the-shelf system that's just going to work and is going to meet your needs. And we know that's not true. I think ideally what you want to do is keep your customizations to a minimum, because if you go the route of Barrett Business Services, BBSI, and you're doing $33 million in customizations, that's just a recipe for disaster, right? You have to take a measured approach, and I think the customizations should only identify, the customizations that you identify should only serve to address the business requirements that are the most important, the functionality gaps that are the most important to be addressed. So I think taking a measured approach and understanding, what you're getting into before you actually get into it is the way to go. That to me is a best practice from the contractual side. Get an estimate as to how much it's going to cost, what the specifications are going to look like. Ideally, have it all mapped out before you even sign the contract. That would be the way to do it. I think that's hard to do. I think it's in some ways unrealistic because the vendor is not going to want to invest that time. But there's ways around that. I mean, if you have to pay them to do some kind of deep analysis or deep dive on the front end, it's going to save you money on the back end, because what you don't want is a train wreck of an implementation, right? You don't want something that's just speeding down the tracks. Customizations are spinning off left and right, and you're just spending more and more money. That's how I would address it.
Yeah, definitely. And just to build on that, I think adding a partner like Third Stage or working with an independent technology agency is definitely a good step in making sure that you're garnering those best practices through years of experience when going through this process. Because like you said, it can be complicated.
And I think that's a great point, because there's resources out there, and I think if you're trying to go it alone, that's not a recipe for success, right? I think if you've got somebody on your team that's really going to be able to help you manage the process, understand what the modifications and customizations are, you're really setting yourself up to have a successful project. Okay, so those are kind of the general lessons, right, of how things go off the rails. So what do you do if you're facing a lawsuit? Okay, first, litigation has to be your last resort. Okay, how much does it cost? Well, it really depends. These are complex commercial cases that are nuanced, that have millions potentially of documents that have to be reviewed by teams of attorneys. One case that we are involved in now, ERP failure case, not the LK case, but another one, we've actually hired a team of independent contractor attorneys to do document review. there's about 40 of them, and it's not inexpensive. Okay, they're doing issue tags, they're highlighting hot documents. I mean, these things are massively expensive. I think you should reasonably expect to spend in legal fees anywhere between $300,000 on the low end, all the way to $1 million if something goes all the way to trial. So I think you have to do whatever it takes to get that software system to work for you, because the alternative is not going to be pretty. You're going to spend upwards of $1 million and be involved in litigation and depositions and testifying for maybe 2 to 3 years easily, and that's not a fun thing. I think you've got to have understanding really that the contract that you think you negotiated with your vendor is probably way worse than you think it is. Okay, the limitation of liability is probably going to give you a year of fees paid prior to the lawsuit. They're probably going to be limited to software fees. You probably paid the software fees on the front end and haven't paid anything in the last year. So your ability to recover anything from them is probably nominal. Okay. We've developed techniques over the years to try to get outside the four corners of that contract and get real relief for our clients. So there's ways to do it, but you're probably fighting an uphill battle. Okay. The warranties are going to be minimal. The remedies associated with that are probably nominal. Maybe you just get to terminate the contract. Maybe you get some kind of refund if you're lucky. You probably don't. Maybe they say you can sue us. None of those are ideal, right? And again, like I said in the beginning, there's usually blame on all sides, right? There will be a tipping point, and in the cases that we take on, the tipping point is usually the fault of the software vendor, not the client. But there's always going to be a tipping point as to where this thing was beyond repair. But without a doubt, there will be blame on your side, and you will have done something that you could have done better. And then finally, success is just it's not guaranteed. I think if you take the same case to 10 juries and you've got the best facts, 7 are going to find against you, or excuse me, 7 will find against for you, but 3 will find against you, and you don't know what jury you've got. So that's problematic. Let's go to the next slide. Just to add to what I said, I mean, I think it's preferable to focus your energy on getting the system to work, right? You don't want to spend unnecessary money on lawyers. The litigation process is incredibly stressful. And I think, like I said, you've got to do everything that you can to get that system to work and to try to avoid litigation, because you don't know what you're getting into. You don't know what you're going to end up with. Guaranteed you're going to have a large legal bill. And you might have to, also pay the vendor for whatever damages they're asserting against you. Let's go to the next slide. To add on to what I said, these vendor contracts are always going to be one-sided. Okay, they limit their liability to next to nothing. I think, the likelihood you're going to have to litigate in another state with attorneys that you're not familiar with, you're going to get home courted. That's how they design the system, and these are clauses that people don't think about on the front end. So the contract is going to work against you in litigation. Let's go to the next slide. I think before you really contemplate getting into litigation, you've got to do kind of a deep dive into what you have done and understand the liability that it potentially creates for you. Okay, because every case the vendor is going to point the finger at you. They're going to say that you didn't make decisions quickly. You didn't have an understanding of the technology. You weren't involved. You weren't fully committed. You weren't dedicating the right kinds of resources. You didn't understand what your business requirements were. And there's probably going to be some level of truth to that. And that makes the case that much more difficult. Okay. And guaranteed there are going to be things that you could have done better, that you didn't do, that you should have done. Let's go to the next slide. I think certainly, it goes without saying that, the likelihood that you're going to win flat out in a trial is not high necessarily. If you've got the best facts, maybe you will, but you certainly don't know what kind of jury you're going to get. And I think you've got to define what success looks like to you. If you're looking for, a total victory where you're going to get all your money back and you're going to get consequential and indirect damages for the cost of your replacement system, that happens, but that certainly is not the most likely outcome. Okay. I think most likely is that you're going to try to settle this on some basis where you get some amount of money back. Maybe there's some sort of discount, on ongoing maintenance to get you to a new system. There's going to be maybe some money that's provided to you that's going to go to the cost of a replacement system potentially. There's a variety of different ways to deal with this, and I think if you're defining success in litigation as an all-out court victory, you're going to be sorely disappointed. The fact of the matter is most cases settle, and they settle on a basis that is short of what your ideal is going to be, and they settle primarily because there's so much uncertainty involved in the situation. And I think it's better if you're involved in litigation to take the reins and control the outcome and take it out of the jury's discretion, where they may not believe everything that you're saying, and they may say, well, you should have known what you're getting into, buyer beware, right? Let's go to the next slide. So it looks like there's some additional questions. We'll answer those. If you have any questions about any of the information that I've talked about today, feel free to touch base with me via email or on any of my social channels here. I'm happy to talk about all this stuff. I find it incredibly interesting. I hope you do too. But again, I think the key takeaways from this really, I hope, are for you, have an understanding of what it takes to be successful. Try to avoid litigation. It's not something that you're going to want to get involved in.